It is Tuesday. It is the 27th of May. Actually, it's Wednesday, excuse me. You're watching ARIRANG, Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gon-young. We're going to begin this Wednesday afternoon with this tragic piece of news. Korea woke up to news of yet another horrible accident this morning. At least 21 people have been killed in a fire at a nursing home in southern Korea. The blaze broke out shortly after midnight at the Changsung Hospital in Jeollanam-do province. Our Na Hyung-kyung starts us off.
Most of the victims were in their 70s as the hospital specializes in taking care of senior citizens with chronic health conditions. 7 people are still receiving medical treatment, but the number of dead is likely to rise as 6 are said to be in serious condition. Firefighters say the blaze was brought under control within half an hour, but many died or were affected from inhaling smoke and toxic gases. Police have taken an 81-year-old male dementia patient into custody on charges of arson. Officers say they have surveillance camera footage of the suspect, identified only by his last name Kim, going in and out of the room that was found to be the origin of the fire. The room was being used to store hospital supplies and was said to have no inflammable materials. The hospital is suspected of having only 1 nurse on the night shift for the ward, taking care of some 80 elderly stroke and dementia patients who would have needed physical assistance to escape. Because the lack of medical staff on duty likely contributed to the high death toll, authorities are looking to see if the hospital broke the law by not having enough staff on standby. Na Hyun-kyung, ARIRANG News.
Government restructuring and new appointments, all of these come in line with President Park Geun-hye's pledge to push ahead with reforms in the aftermath of the Sewol ferry disaster. But this latest spate of accidents has again laid bare the country's inadequate safety management system, and it's denting the president's efforts. Our correspondent Choi Yoo-sun has more.
The sinking of the Sewol ferry on April 16th and the government's insufficient management of the accident forced many to think about problems and ill practices within the Korean society.
이번 참사로 우리는 고귀한 생명을 너무나 많이 잃었습니다. 그 희생이 헛되지 않도록 대한민국의 개혁과 대변혁을 반드시 만들어가는 것이 남은 우리들의 의무라고 생각합니다.
On Tuesday, President Park emphasized the need to increase efficiency and responsibility within the government by appointing a new deputy prime minister to look after areas outside the economy and security. At a cabinet meeting Tuesday, the president said alongside the current deputy prime minister and finance minister and the head of the National Security Office, the new deputy prime minister should be given the task of overseeing the remaining issues mainly related to education, society, and culture. Officials at the presidential office say the new system reflects the president transferring more responsibilities to the executive branch, with the prime minister in charge of law and order, public sector reforms, and public safety, and his deputies in charge of other areas. The Ministry of Security and Public Administration, which came under fire for its lax response to the recent ferry accident, will have its safety and personnel management roles transferred to new ministries under the prime minister's office. And it's anticipated the president will carry out major reshuffles within the cabinet and the presidential office after the June 4th local elections. However, with news of other safety-related accidents causing dozens of deaths this week, it's doubtful whether the president's reform measures will help assuage public anger at the government. Choi Yoo-sun, ARIRANG News.
And in line with that, fire departments and maritime safety agencies may soon be empowered to take command of the military and police in emergency situations. That's just one of the changes being considered in a set of revised bills spurred on by last month's ferry disaster. Well, the Ministry of Security and Public Administration also said government safety inspectors may be granted power of the judicial police in an effort to boost safety management. The revisions, which also included the establishment of a new deputy prime minister and the formation of new safety and personnel ministries under the prime minister's office, will be formally announced Thursday. Now, after gathering public opinion on the changes, the bills will go to the National Assembly for a vote. Meanwhile, despite marathon negotiations at the National Assembly over launching a parliamentary probe into last month's Sewol ferry disaster, The rival parties remain at odds over a number of critical issues. The talks began Tuesday with the ruling Saenuri Party and opposition parties divided on the method and timing of the investigation. While the families of victims attended the negotiations and stayed throughout the night, demanding a swift agreement. Now, they also warned politicians not to use the accident for political purposes. 16 victims remain unaccounted for and no bodies have been found since last week. And to speed up efforts, the families of the missing have agreed to let authorities cut into the 4th floor of the sunken vessel, and that operation was expected to begin in the afternoon.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
The United States will deploy a dozen of F-16 fighter jets on the Korean Peninsula next month. According to the U.S. Pacific Air Forces, the 7th Air Force will dispatch 12 F-16 fighters to Kunsan Air Base on June 1st. The forces say it's part of a regular deployment to the region that's been ongoing since 2004 to maintain peace and stability in Northeast Asia. Well, there has been a flurry of diplomatic activity in recent months to jumpstart the long-stalled six-party talks on North Korea's denuclearization. North Korea, however, is refusing to make concessions on its nuclear program. Our Hwang Ji-hye sat down with Victor Cha. He is the Korea chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she asked him whether he thought the talks would resume anytime soon.
Bringing back North Korea to the negotiating table could take some time. In an interview with ARIRANG News on Tuesday, Victor Cha, Korea chair for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, said the United States has shown some flexibility, but that its offer remains unanswered.
But I think what the United States is saying is that, look, if you show you're willing to stop testing and allow inspectors back in, then the U.S. is willing to come back to negotiations. It's a sign of flexibility on the part of the United States to keep the negotiations alive. But the North Koreans don't seem to be interested in that right now.
While some view the so-called six-party talks as an old formula, the visiting expert said the multilateral framework is still a valid way to denuclearize Pyongyang. The six-party talks involving the two Koreas, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, broke down in December 2008.
The U.S.-North Korea bilateral is important because North Korea wants to talk to the United States. But the six-party format is also important because it ensures that whatever agreements are made between the U.S. and North Korea are reaffirmed in the six-party context to ensure that, in particular, the North Koreans comply with the agreements.
Dr. Cha says China could take a stronger role by linking North Korea's economic aid to its denuclearization, but that it's not ready to take that risk.
If they cut off things too severely, they could collapse the regime. And right now, at least their calculation is that that is not worth the risk, even though it means a slowly developing nuclear program.
And the remaining 5 parties have problems of their own. For instance, South Korea and Japan are at odds over historical issues. Dr. Cha says the friction will affect the ability to coordinate effectively on North Korea, which is why the two neighbors both need to take action.
I certainly think that Japan should issue an apology for the comfort women. But if the Japanese issue an apology, I think the South Koreans have to be ready to accept an apology.
Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Barack Obama will remove all troops from Afghanistan by 2016, starting with reducing the troop presence there to just 9,800 and an end to the U.S. combat mission at the close of 2014. The move will mark the first time in Mr. Obama's presidency that the U.S. has not had an active combat mission in a foreign country. Here's our Hwang Ji-hye with this report.
When U.S. President Barack Obama leaves office in early 2017, the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan will be near zero. The president said Tuesday that less than 10,000 American troops will remain in Afghanistan after this year, and roughly half that number will be in the country by the end of 2015. A year later, the United States will pull out its last remaining combat troops.
1 year later, by the end of 2016, our military will draw down to a normal embassy presence in Kabul with a security assistance component, just as we've done in Iraq.
It will put an end to more than 12 years of war launched shortly after the September 11th attacks. More than 2,000 U.S. troops have died in the conflict, plus countless more on the Afghan side. There are currently around 32,000 American troops in Afghanistan. Obama said that so much of America's foreign policy was focused on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that the future of Afghanistan must be decided by Afghans.
Yet this is how wars end in the 21st century. Not through signing ceremonies, but through decisive blows against our adversaries, transitions to elected governments.
The withdrawal plan has not come without criticism in the U.S. as Republicans say the timeline is too tight. Hwang Ji-hye, ARIRANG News.
Well, despite last month's ferry disaster, the Korean economy has remained on a recovery path in the months of April and May. That is according to the Bank of Korea's annual Golden Book report, which was released today. Now, it notes that the manufacturing sector has seen improvement thanks to robust overseas shipments and productions. But it is a different story, however, on the consumer sentiment, of course. The retail and service sectors have seen a slump in sales since the Sewol ferry disaster on April 16th, but the report expects the May numbers, when they are released, to rebound. Now, drive around any major city in Korea these days, and you'll notice a lot more of those Audis, BMWs, and Volkswagens than you would have even a few years back. And this is because more Korean consumers are buying imported cars. The Korea Automobile Manufacturers Association says that over 75,000 cars worth over $2.5 billion were imported into Korea in the first 4 months of the year. Well, in terms of volume, this is up 54% from the same period last year. The number of imported cars registered last month also set a record at 16,000. And analysts forecast imported cars to make up 15% of the Korean market this year, which is up from 12.7% in 2013. Korea and the United Arab Emirates will work together in tapping into other nuclear energy markets, mostly Middle Eastern and African countries, which includes Saudi Arabia. Now, Korea's Trade Minister Yoon Sang-jik said Tuesday that the two countries are not far away from signing a memorandum of understanding on this issue. Yoon adds that leaders of Seoul and Abu Dhabi reached an agreement in principle during President Park Geun-hye's recent trip to the region, where Korea's technology is being used to build nuclear power plants there. Korea will also likely be able to seal the deal on becoming the main operator for the next 6 decades of the nuclear reactors in the UAE currently under construction. The contract will likely be worth some $20 billion. Well, the newest flagship smartphone by Korea's tech giant LG Electronics hits the shelves in 100 countries this Friday, including right here in Korea. The next generation G3, it has a larger screen than its predecessor at 5.5 inches and a quad HD display with 2 times better resolution. LG Electronics hopes the G3 helps the company take a bite out of Apple and Samsung's vice-like grip on the global smartphone market. Now, in the first quarter of this year, LG had a 4.2% share of the market with sales of $3.2 billion. The so-called creative economy has been touted as the next growth model that's going to transform Korea over the coming years and even decades. Now, with this in mind, our Park Ji-won reports on the government's plans to nurture the next generation of creative thinkers.
26-year-old Lee Jun-min and his classmates have developed a program for a simple manual game.
We wanted to create a game that requires interactive body movements like when we played with shadows as children.
And university student Shin Jae-won has been involved in a storytelling business project.
We realize the storytelling industry's immense possible influence on the creative economy, as it can provide an endless amount of new items.
They are some of Korea's young pioneers with creative minds, the fuel that runs the country's creative economy. According to a definition by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, at the heart of any creative economy is the contents industry, which spans diverse sectors like film, music, and gaming. But these sectors are not new to Korea, which has the world's 7th biggest media entertainment industry, raking in some $45 billion in 2012. The nation's contents industry in total logged an annual revenue of nearly $90 billion last year, up more than 4% on year. Zeroing in on its great potential for growth, the government aims to increase its annual revenue further to nearly $120 billion by 2017. As one of many efforts to stimulate the nation's creativity, the first Content Korea Lab, a free public center equipped with diverse facilities like recording studios and video editing rooms, opened in Seoul.
Content Korea Lab is where anyone with creative ideas can gather and fuse their minds with others to initiate new projects.
The Culture Ministry plans to open 10 more centers nationwide by 2017 to act as hubs for inspiring and cultivating even greater creativity for the future. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
Well, speaking of creative minds, Korean researchers have developed a device that can supply electricity to trains without wires. Now, this is particularly exciting as they say the new system is not only safer, but will allow trains to go even faster. Our Kim Min-ji reports.
This KTX bullet train is able to move as electricity is supplied through high-tension wires installed above the tracks. What you see now is a next-generation high-speed train called Haemu. Unlike the KTX, it doesn't have a device that supplies electricity. Instead, it receives electricity wirelessly through a device that is installed between the tracks. Let's see how it works. The wireless device receives 1 megawatt of electricity from a nearby inverter, which forms a high-frequency magnetic field of 60 kilohertz. A power collector installed underneath the train absorbs this magnetic field and converts it back into electricity, making the train move. Although the technology is already used worldwide, Korea has become the first country to succeed in transferring this amount of electricity. And as it does not require the installation of high-tension wires, it is safer and cuts down on maintenance costs. Researchers say that when the technology is applied to high-speed trains, they will be able to travel faster than now.
When the upper system of the train is removed, there is no speed resistance. This means that the train can raise its speed significantly. As there is no resistance, it also reduces energy consumption.
The Korea Railroad Research Institute plans to commercialize the technology starting next year. Kim Min-ji, ARIRANG News.
A drop in private consumption is the main reason the Korea Development Institute dropped its growth forecast for this year. Now, this comes as consumers have been spending less since the ferry disaster last month. And although the think tank did not see this as a long-term risk, the slow consumption pulled down the country's 2014 economic growth forecast to 3.7%. Let's take a closer look. We have Dr. Kim Byung-ju live on the line. Good afternoon to you, Dr. Kim. First, on GDP growth growth projection for this year. The KDI number did not change from the previous forecast, but this is a downward adjustment because of the new GDP calculation method. Am I correct?
Right, that is indeed correct. But then again, because the number hasn't changed, I don't know, it's a human instinct. I feel hesitant to call it a drop. But it is indeed a drop considering that there has been adjustment in terms of the way they calculate GDP lately. So indeed they're talking about this is like a 0.2% drop from the previous number, which was again 3.7. And this is a big concern, as you just have pointed out, because we have Sewol disaster in our minds, basically. And, we are seeing the overall consumer sentiment numbers going down. The Bank of Korea's latest report on May's consumer sentiment shows shows like 3-point drop from the previous level of, consumer sentiment. So indeed, we were hoping when Sewol disaster happened, we were hoping that this would quickly be over, at least in terms of the hindrance in the minds of consumers from consumer. But looks like it seems to be having a much deeper impact in terms of consumer behavior. So this is indeed a cause of concern, and it is quite interesting to see the Bank of Korea consumer sentiment research report coming out almost at the same time as this GDP projection from KDI as well, and showing overall considerable impact on the growth as a whole. Now, one consolation, as you can see on the screen, is that next year it will be better, 3.8%. And also this year, the aggregate is 3.7. When we say 3.7, it's a big improvement from last year's 3% growth here. So, looking at the bright side, we can highlight those points. But then again, below 4% growth itself is always a big disappointment for Korea. So that's what we are having in our mind.
Right. I think experts have been talking about the domestic consumption picking up as a key factor in impacting Korea's growth this year and next. And of course, because of the Sewol ferry disaster, that sentiment has been pulled down, and we're seeing an impact from there. Now, let's try breaking this down and this report down into different categories. What do we see in terms of the unemployment rate projection?
Unemployment looks pretty okay here. Basically, we had a worse time during the first quarter this year, and now the number seems to be going down according to the KDI projection. And second quarter, we are expecting 3.6% unemployment, and then it will go all the way down to 3.1% by fourth quarter, making this year's annual total about 3.5% unemployment. I think it's, relatively speaking, comparative sense, this is quite a good situation here. But of course, next year we want to see the unemployment going even further down, and that seems to be what KDI is projecting. And I think the government, whose focus is heavily on job creation, seems to feel quite good about that, at least in this aspect of unemployment.
Now, as for the consumer prices, I see that KDI does not see deflation possibilities.
Right, indeed. We've been talking a lot about the deflation possibility for quite some time, but looks like the lowest point was the first quarter this year, where we saw 1.1% growth. But it's picking up, and overall, by the end of the year, annual total, we will get to see 1.6%. Price increase. And next year, KDI is saying that we should expect about 2.3% price increase. So that's pretty much kind of like normal thing for this economy. So at least if we take KDI's words at its face value, we'll have to wait and see on this one. But it looks like that the so-called deflation fear seems to be something that we can set aside, at least for now.
Well, on the external side, we have good and bad news, I suppose. Current account surplus this year will be almost as big as last year, but next year it's going to be smaller.
Good and bad news indeed, because it is a good news in terms of our concerns of any possibility of global uncertainties. And anytime when we have great global uncertainties popping up somewhere around the corner of the world, it's always good to have large size of foreign exchange reserve, and for that to happen, we gotta need a large size current account surplus. But bad news, as you point out, that's because that will push the valuation of won upwards, and that will hurt Korea's exports. And Korea's exports are such an important part of the economy as a whole. So what we are seeing here is we will continue to see the pressure for continuous appreciation, perhaps, for the Korean currency won. So let's keep our eyes on that in the future.
All right, we definitely shall do that. Dr. Kim Byung-ju, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
And that is your business today on this Wednesday. Thank you for watching, and do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.